All right. Well, we're going to be talking about the two different papers that I did for Luke Acts class. Um, so we're talking about my two papers from Luke 19, verse 28 through 48. And this presentation brought to you by Jeremy Castellanos. And this will be my slides for the rest of the night. So, if you have any questions, consult the previews right here. So that's what we're going to talk about. The first paper is what we'll start out with. And we will discuss my findings from the first paper, which was titled The Narrative Critical Approach to Luke 19, verses 28 through 48. So in dealing with my first paper, and if you need to pause it to see the references and to see all the information that's on the slides, you just go right ahead. But for the moment, I'm going to keep it kind of to the side. That way you can see everything while I'm speaking. So the first thing is that we dealt with rhetoric. Since this is a narrative critical paper, we were going to deal with the subject of rhetoric. So the first thing that Noland tells us is that this paper, or that this chapter, is a travel narrative. So if you're not familiar with the story of Luke 19, verse 28 through 48, we're talking about the so-called triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So the way that Luke opens up this narrative, as opposed to the other gospel writers, this is one of the few events that is recorded in all four gospels. But the way that Luke opens up this narrative is by using the rhetorical piece of travel narrative. So from the beginning until the end of the narrative, Jesus always seems to be traveling to Jerusalem, and then suddenly he's there, but you never come to the place where you realize that Jesus is in Jerusalem. So, unlike the other gospel writers, he writes about the fact that Jesus just kind of shows up. But the other gospel writers talk about when he definitively enters Jerusalem. So, Luke is the only one that does that. And so, Nolan brings out quite a bit of information about that. You can see that reference down here. The other thematic piece in Luke 19, then we'll call it Luke 19 from here going forward, so I don't have to keep saying verse 28 through 48, because there is the parables that in the former part of the narrative that Luke obviously writes. Verse 28 is not the beginning of the chapter, obviously, but from here on going forward, we're going to just call it Luke 19 for brevity's sake. We don't want to be here all night. So Jesus is the Lord of his death. He determines the circumstances of what's going to happen to him and how he's going to die. So Jesus is the Lord, or the Messiah, or the master of his death, according to Bach, page 1546. But also, as we were talking about this not being the beginning of the chapter, Nolan comes back and says that Jesus is being contrasted to the king that was in the parable earlier on in the chapter. So, whereas you have the one king, Jesus is a different sort of king. He's the embodiment of what a good king should be like. He's the righteous king, if you will, that Nolan talks about in page 682 of the reference that we will come to here shortly. So for the second slide, we come to the subject of setting. As I was suggesting, this being a travel narrative, Jesus is apparently going from Bethany and the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. He is consistently traveling from one locale to the other without ever having quite arrived in Jerusalem, as we were suggesting that Nolan talked about earlier. So he goes from Bethany to the Mount of Olives and down from there down from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. Now, the Mount of Olives, you must understand, is very prophetic. If you've ever read your Bible in Zechariah chapter 14, you know that the Messiah is said, verse 4, is said to touch down on the Mount of Olives. So the fact that Jesus is coming from the Mount of Olives, down from the Mount of Olives, up into Jerusalem is very prophetically significant. It's highly prophetic, as we're suggesting here. The other point of the setting, the reason that the setting is important as well, is not only that it reminisces prophecy about the Messiah and his coming, although Zechariah 14 verse 4 is talking about the second coming, I would argue, as with the gospel writers in other places, but that's not the point of my paper. But Jerusalem is significant also because it asks the question of what's going to happen if Jesus meets his foes, if he enters into Jerusalem and has to become an emissary of God to the people of Jerusalem. What would that look like if Jesus himself, this startling figure from all of the book of Luke thus far, what happens when he finally comes to Jerusalem? Well, Culpeper on page 367 gives a lot of commentary about what that would be like, what Jesus would do if he was in Jerusalem. That's exactly what Luke was writing about here. And we got to move along quite quickly. Characterization. The point that Luke draws out is that there's a contrast between the Pharisees and the disciples, and also between Jesus and the rest of them. Obviously, Jesus is a kingly figure and a prophetic figure throughout this whole narrative, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But the contrast is how the disciples are celebrating, they're worshiping, they're rejoicing at what God is getting ready to do through this king that has come to Jerusalem. But the Pharisees quickly resort to telling Jesus to rebuke his disciples. That's quite a bit different than what Jesus himself was about, as Jesus turned around and rebuked them right after that. And then at the end of the narrative, you see the Pharisees, who are not named by this point, or the rest of the Gospel of Luke, for that matter, they are mentioned as being the leadership of Jerusalem. So you have the Pharisees versus the disciples. This is one big characterization, one big difference in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke 19. So Jesus is also the outsider. He's a dynamic and fluid character in the book of Luke, whereas the Pharisees and even the disciples remain very static. They remain very much the same at the beginning as at the end. The disciples never change their posture. There's no any kind of dynamic parts to them. But Jesus does, as much as we could say Jesus remains the same today, yesterday, and forever, he is quite dynamic in this narrative in that he goes from a very kingly figure and a prophetic figure to a very prophet figure. He goes from basically the culmination of many prophecies and a king that has come to Jerusalem into a prophetic and teaching figure in Jerusalem itself. So that's important. We get to the point of view. Luke is, of course, very supportive of Jesus, otherwise he wouldn't be writing this gospel. The Pharisees are obviously bad. They're opposing Jesus. They're plotting against him at the end of the book of Luke, or at the end of Luke 19. And obviously, as you find out throughout the rest of the book of Luke, they're opposed to him and they get him killed. So this is a showdown between Jesus and the Pharisees. That's what this is representative of. And as Kinman talks about, the narrative goes from celebratory to tragic. It goes from happy to sad. It's not good at the end like it is in the beginning. However, of course, Luke writing from a very positive perspective means that Jesus is going to represent some great things, and there's some great foreshadowing as well. So that was my first, we're also, of course, the reader is assumed as Theophilus from the very beginning of the book of Luke, as you see here. Jesus is an outsider coming in. He brings many great things. And here is the bibliography. It's backwards, but I know you can read my writing backwards. So I didn't have time to finish all this, so this is what I came up with, and there it is. I'll pause for a couple more seconds just so you could see it. I used a total of 4 sources: Bach, Culpeper, Nolan, and Kinman, which are in my papers for this presentation. So we move on to the second part. We have 5 minutes. Paper 2. What scriptures did Luke bring from the Old Testament? Well, I argue quite extensively that he used Zechariah 14:4 as a means of reflection and as a narrative piece, as a way of kind of driving forward his narrative. The readers reading what he had to write would basically come to the conclusion that, oh wow, this sounds a lot like Zechariah 14:4, only in the opposite. So Strauss also seems to think that throughout the narrative that Zechariah 14:4 is in the back of Luke's mind. Zechariah 9:9 comes at the middle of the narrative, talking about Jesus riding on a donkey. So again, it's interlaced throughout the narrative. It's not ever just set up. It's not quoted directly, but it is alluded to very strongly when Jesus comes on a donkey. Psalm 118 verse 26 is in the mouth of the disciples and the great mass of people when he meets them in Jerusalem, or somewhere in between there. Luke is not specific. It's actually quoted Psalm 118 verse 26, and then Jesus quotes from Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah 7:11, which is also significant, as we will get to talking about here in a second. So we continue on. So what's the New Testament context, or what's the Old Testament context in the New Testament? Basically, this section of my paper, I talk about how the Jews are oppressed. As you know, with any New Testament study, especially in the Gospels, the fact is that the Jews are under oppression by the Roman Empire, and they're expecting a king to come and save them and go to war. Well, the Messiah is said to come. There's a lot of prophecies that are alluded to throughout this narrative. Jesus becomes that king, that prophetic kingly figure that comes in the name of the Lord, as the disciples said, and he's come to rescue them, so they might think. But really, he comes in peaceful terms instead of war terms, as Smith points out here. Instead of coming on a horse ready for war, he comes as an already triumphant king, already conquered, on a donkey, showing his peaceful intentions. Nobody can mistake that the actions he was making were deliberate and intentionally very peaceful. So we move on. What is the Old Testament context? This is a little harder to read. I apologize, especially because now it's backwards. I didn't have time to get it all done. So Zechariah, the way that Luke uses Zechariah in this narrative is to show that the Jews, or in his own context, he was prophesying during a time in which the Jews were coming back from Babylon and Persia, which you can find from Peterson, pages 9 through 11. Again, it's backwards, so I'm going to just tell you what they are as we go. So that was important. That's one very important context. I deal with some others in brief as per the syllabus, but in my paper, that's the one that I focus on the most. What was the context of Zechariah, especially since I drew from verse 4, chapter 14, verse 4, and 9, verse 9. So what text did he use? Undoubtedly, he used, as Krauss, a German writer who was translated, actually says that he draws from the LXX primarily. Psalm 118, verse 26, he does something a little bit different than what is in the actual text, because as they say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, but Luke does his own thing by making it include the word king. Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. So that's important. So Krauss, check out his stuff, page 400. You'll see that in the bibliography that we're going to get to here in a second. So pay attention to that. Here again, Luke uses LXX. David Norris, Brother David Norris, talks a lot about the use of the LXX and how that was detrimental to the faith. But he also brings out some important points of translation and how that became relevant, and how that also was very highly evangelistic on on Luke's part. So that's important. So check that out if you want to know more about that, and also my paper. The rhetorical use, you'll have to see my first paper. That was important. And lastly, here's my bibliography. So, conclusion, Luke is a beast. This was great. I love writing this. Here's my bibliography. Thank you very much.